upside down and backwards. I'm the type of person that loves puzzles. Anyone that knows me well knows I love to figure out the solutions. I'm like a dog with a bone when it comes to puzzles. I have to get to the bottom of it and solve it. I do Sudoku and crosswords, and I love the mechanical ones that you turn and twist until you get the two metal parts to come apart. When I travel, I have a metal puzzle that's in my computer bag that has had me stumped for nearly a year. My daughter gave it to me, and it is rated as one of the hardest puzzles to solve. So I sit on the plane, twisting, turning, and trying to solve it month after month. Even with a checkbook, if it does not balance to the penny, I have to find out why. It's not because I need the pennies. It's because I need to understand what happened to them. Where did they go? What caused the unbalance? I need to solve the mystery. Even when I can't solve a problem, it will still be churning around in the back of my mind. The puzzle of where do we go when we die, as you can imagine, is always churning around in my mind. I'm sure you've all wondered at some time, is there a heaven? We come to church each Sunday, and we grow in our faith, and we share our prayers, but is there a little bit of doubting Thomas in us? When Pastor Jeremy asked me to do the sermon for today, I honestly felt I was not going to have the time to fit something like that in, but I agreed to do it and tried to think about what to say. I ended up standing in the religious section at Barnes & Noble and scanning the bookshelves for ideas. I wanted something to jump out at me. Then I saw a book. It was called Heaven is for Real. Then I saw a book called To Heaven and Back. Then another. Proof of Heaven. I guess I was getting a message. I bought all 3 books and decided I would read them and that I would talk about them as my topic for the sermon today. The first book I read was Heaven is for Real. It is about a young boy of 4 years old who suffers a ruptured appendix, and he needs to get his insides cleaned out from the toxins. During his time on the operating table, he has a near-death experience where he visits heaven. The boy's name is Colton, and there are several remarkable instances in this book that pop out of this child. At first, his dad teases him when they're at an intersection near the hospital where he had his operation. His dad teases that he could take Colton back to the hospital, but the boy just says that is where the angels sang to him and Jesus held him in his lap. Of course, his mom and dad are stunned by the remarks and they interrogate him further. Colton describes in detail heaven and angels, and he asks his dad about Pop, his grandfather. Although he describes Pop, he does not recognize him from a picture that his dad has on his desk. And it is not until much later that his grandmother sends a photograph of her husband taken in 1943 that Colton is able to point out Pop without hesitation. One day, Colton walks in to tell his mom he has 2 sisters. His mom is taken aback and thinks he is confused with a cousin. Let me read you an excerpt from this. One evening in October, I, that's his father, was sitting at the kitchen table working on a sermon. Sonia, that's his wife, Colton's mother, was around the corner in the living room working on the business books, processing job tickets and sorting through payables. Cassie, that's Colton's sister, was playing Barbie dolls at her feet. I heard Colton's footsteps padding up the hallway and caught a glimpse of him circling the couch, where he then planted himself directly in front of Sonia. "Mommy, I have 2 sisters, Colton said. I put down my pen. Sonia didn't, she kept working. Colton repeated himself. "Mommy, I have 2 sisters. Sonia looked up from her paperwork, shook her head slightly and said, "No, you have your sister Cassie, and do you mean your cousin Tracy?" "No," Colton clipped off the word adamantly. "I have 2 sisters. You had a baby die in your tummy, didn't you?" At that moment, time stopped in the Burpo household. And Sonia's eyes grew wide, and just a few seconds before, Colton had been trying to get her attention. He now had her undivided attention. Who told you I had a baby die in my tummy? She did, Mommy. She said she died in your tummy. The book was a compelling read, but a lot of Colton's descriptions were very biblical. And I felt that although he had a near-death experience, that some of the descriptions in the book felt like they were embellished by his dad, who was a pastor. I continued on my quest, and the second book I read was from Dr. Mary C. Neal, who went on a kayaking trip to Chile. When she was on the trip, she went down a waterfall and her kayak got trapped underwater. She was with a team of kayakers, and as soon as she was in trouble and went under the water, one of the members started a stopwatch. Later on, it was found out she was under for 12 minutes. As Dr. Neal drowned, she describes leaving her body and experiencing floating with others towards a great hall. I'll read an excerpt for you. This is her talking. At the moment my body was released and I began to tumble, I felt a pop. It felt as if I had finally shaken off my heavy outer layer, freeing my soul. I rose up out of the river, and when my soul broke through the surface of the water, I encountered a team of 15 to 20 souls. Spirits sent by God, who greeted me with the most overwhelming joy I had ever experienced or could imagine. It was a joy of unadulterated core level. While I could not identify each spiritual being as someone by name, I knew each of them well, knew they were from God, and knew that I had known them for an eternity. I was part of them, and I knew that they were sent to guide me across the divide of time and dimension that separates our world from God's. I also had the unspoken understanding that they were sent not only to greet me and guide me, but also to protect me during my journey. They appeared as formed shapes, but not with the absolute and distinct edges of formed physical bodies have on earth. Their edges were blurred, and each spiritual being was dazzling and radiant. Their presence engulfed all of my senses, as though I could see, hear, feel, smell, and taste them all at once. Their brilliance was both blinding and invigorating. We did not speak per se, using our mouths, but easily communicated in a very pure form. We simultaneously communicated our thoughts and emotions, and understood each other perfectly, even though we did not use language. When she was traveling with these angels, and she was traveling towards a great light, which turned out to be a great hall. After arriving at the hall, she was disappointed that she could not stay. But later she found herself in a field with an angel, and she was able to talk to the angel about life. Here's an excerpt from that. I was having a conversation with an angel who was sitting on a nearby rock. I call the being an angel, but I don't really know what he was. Angel, messenger, Christ, or teacher. I do know that he was of God, in God, and from God. As we conversed, I asked questions and he gave me answers. We discussed how to rejoice always, even in the midst of terrible circumstances, and discussed the long-standing question, why do bad things happen to good people? During this conversation, I received the following wisdom. We are each given the opportunity and privilege to come to earth for different reasons. Sometimes we come in order that we may personally develop and strengthen the fruits of our spirit, those of love, kindness, patience, joy, peace, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Sometimes we come to help someone else develop in the fruits of the Spirit. We all come to earth to become more Christ-like. In preparation for our journey to earth, we are able to make a basic outline for our life. This is not to imply that we, the humans, are entirely in charge of our life's design. It is more like God creates it. Then we review and discuss it with our quotes, personal planning angel. Within the algorithm, we are written branch points in our lives at which times we may exit, returning to God, or we may be redirected to a different task and goal. We may be directed to these branch points by our conscious choice and by our circumstances, or we may be pushed along by angelic intervention. Have you ever shown up somewhere at just the right time? When you think back on your life, can you remember a person who briefly entered your life, saying something or doing something that impacted your life out of proportion to what they actually said or did? What were the circumstances that brought you together with your spouse, or the detailed circumstances of other such notable events in your life? Have you ever been randomly thinking about someone who then unexpectedly shows up or contacts you? Has something ever happened that left you thinking, that's weird? Consider whether these are sets of coincidences or whether they might be orchestrated events, evidence of God's hand in our lives. The skeptics of near-death experiences argue that these experiences are simply the brain dying, and that as the brain shuts down, that we are experiencing this phenomena. What is very interesting is the last book I read was about a neurosurgeon whose brain was completely dead, which defies what the skeptics say, because how can you be experiencing the brain dying if you're already brain dead? The neurosurgeon is Dr. Eben Alexander. He got a very rare case of E. coli meningitis that attacked his brain and he went into a coma. He describes being in a transparent but murky substance like mud, but he felt warm and secure. He did not know who he was or where he was, but he did not care. I'll read an excerpt of, this is when he's in the morgue. I didn't have a body, not one that I was aware of anyway. I was simply there, in this place of pulsing, pounding darkness. At the time, I might have called it primordial, but at the time it was going on, I didn't know this word. In fact, I didn't know any words at all. The words used here registered much later when I was back in the world. I was writing down my recollections. Language, emotion, logic, these were all gone, as if I had regressed back to some state of being from the very beginnings of life, as far back, perhaps, as the primitive bacteria that was, unbeknownst to me, had taken over my brain and shut it down. How long did I reside in this world? I have no idea. When you go to a place that there's no sense of time, as we experience it in the ordinary world, accurately describing the way it feels is next to impossible. When it is happening, when I was there, I felt like whatever I was had always been there and always would continue to be. He continues and he describes how he gets increasingly more uncomfortable in the morgue and how he feels he does not belong there and he wants to get out. Then an entity approached him and he stated that if he tried for the rest of his life, he could not do justice in describing how beautiful it was. He describes how he saw a beautiful light, and then as he was looking through the light, he moved through it in a flash, and he was in another world. He tries to describe this world with words, but he says that our words cannot do it justice. As an example, he says, how can you describe what love tastes like? He talks about how limited our brains is here on earth, and therefore all the things he learned in the spirit world are impossible to describe. In the spirit world, he would think of a question and simultaneously he would have the answer with a deep understanding that is not attainable here on earth. He visited what he calls a gateway, and he describes it as a blackness, but filled with brilliant light, and he felt God's presence there. He said he felt as though there was no distance between him and God, but at the same time, he could see how minuscule he was in God's presence. He has tried very hard to describe his experiences, and he talks about an orb that travels with him as he enters the core beyond the gateway, and how he gets vast amounts of knowledge, but he says it will take a lifetime using his limited brain to try and recover all the information he received when he was in the spirit form. Eventually, the gateway is closed to him, and he feels so disappointed. He descends and ends up in the murk again, but this time he sees faces that he recognizes, and later finds out that these are the ones that were in his room praying for him to return. Needless to say, he makes a full recovery and writes about his journey. I feel that after reading these books, they have reinforced my belief that there is in fact a heaven and removed my doubting Thomas thoughts. I believe that when we pass on to the next life, there is a God that loves each and every one of us, and that we will be welcomed back after our journey here on earth. Amen.